Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm taking on a very special adventure. I'm actually coming to you from New York City and on the north end of Central Park, up on 110 West, and I'm going to work my way through the entire park from north to south, looking at some of the geology here. I'm really excited to check out the rocks here. They record a lot of interesting stories, everything from big mountain building events to ancient oceans to giant glaciers sculpting the landscape. So come join me today. Let's learn about the geology of Central Park. So welcome to Central Park, a park that was really created. So much of what's actually here is not natural landscape except for the rocks, which Olmsted and Vall, who are the two gentlemen who designed Central Park, used as part of their landscaping. So the rocks are really the only original thing that's here. Everything else was an architectural design for the main park. But what I'm most interested in are these rocks. The Manhattan Shist, which are the rocks we're mostly going to be looking at here, were actually initially deposited and was known as the Iapetus Ocean, which was the ocean that separated ancient North America from ancient Africa, and puts them at about 440 million to 480 million years old or so. Since that time, they've gone through a lot of mountain building events, actually 3 of them. We'll talk about those as we continue on. All right, so I worked my way kind of parallel to 110th Street, and you'll see there's a big rock behind me. In fact, there's some huge rocks that are sticking out here, and this is all part of that Manhattan Shist. Now, what I want to do is zoom in and talk a little bit about this unique rock. First thing to mention is that this is a metamorphic rock. So the protolith, or original rock, was actually a bunch of mudstones and maybe some sandstones in some areas, but mostly mudstones that were all part of that ancient ocean about 450 million years ago between North America and Africa at that time. What happened then was known as the tectonic orogeny, a big mountain building event where you had these island arcs slamming into North America. It's similar to what we see with the Aleutian Islands today. And so all these old mudstones and seafloor deposits got buried really deep, got really hot, and were put under a lot of pressure and ended up becoming what we call metamorphosed. And if we look in closely at these rocks, you can actually see some muscovite in here. There are some what we call porphyroblast, some other kinds of material. I'm not exactly sure what those are that are mixed up here. They could be garnets, they could be something else. But what I read is there is magnetite in these rocks as well. And magnetite, as its name suggests, is magnetic. Unfortunately, I do not have a magnet with me. I do want to point out how there's a fabric. And so we call this fabric foliation, and all this foliation is kind of trending towards the northeast across the entire park. And that's a function of these rocks being heated up and folded during the tectonic orogeny, but they were also affected by 2 other orogenies as well. And we'll talk about those a little bit more as we get farther along inside the park. As I mentioned, the landforms that we're going to see here are all architectural design, but it still means it's absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, and there's great places to see some of the different rocks here, and you can really see that Manhattan Schist and that foliation here at the Loch Waterfall. So what we see as we go along, again, is not all natural, but it is absolutely beautiful here in Central Park. Continuing to work my way through the park, and along the loch here, they actually have these ice rescue ladders. So when these ponds freeze over and they start to thaw, if somebody falls into these ponds, although they're not very deep, but it allows folks to be able to be rescued from different portions of the loch here. Working my way along the loch pathway, and you can see again a lot of this Manhattan Schist as boulders being exposed. I also want to point out just these absolutely beautiful trees. Now, all the trees that are here were also placed by the architects. So everything in this park is truly by design. There's very few things that are actually natural to it except for the rocks. I'm just above the loch, and check out the beautiful large pieces of mica within this schist. Now it looks like there's some gneiss down below, so you can see the granitic or pegmatitic material, but it's all been metamorphosed. But look at the size and how shiny those pieces of mica are. Pretty spectacular. beautiful, beautiful metamorphic rocks here. One thing that's exciting as I'm at the park here is literally around every trail, every turn, find something pretty phenomenal like this gigantic arch. And to get an idea of scale, here I am, and the arch has to be at least 2 of me, so something like 12 feet tall up there. Absolutely spectacular. As I'm walking through, I'll scan and look at this arch, which goes to something called the pond. And we can see some really nice pegmatitic dikes that are going through the schist here that they use as part of the building stone. Now, these are out of place, but it tells me that they actually use the rocks here from this area to actually build all the architecture, thereby making sure it fits in with the natural landscape. Pretty brilliant architectural design for this entire park. And you come out of the arch to this amazing waterfall. I'm now at the pond, and if I look off to my left, we can actually see how the Manhattan Shist has been glaciated. And so how do I know it's been glaciated? It's been smoothed, and so you can see how it has this gentle topography to it, and we can actually see maybe in some areas some striae or lines associated with the glaciation. But the reason these portions of the Manhattan Shist make these little nubs, if you will, across this part of the park is because the glaciers come over the top of them and ground it down, giving this kind of flatter look to these features. Now, there have been multiple ice ages or glacier movement across this area. The latest one was about 12,000 years ago, and that's what would be recorded by these low expressions of the Manhattan Shist, is where they were ground down about 12,000 years ago, recording the last of those motions of the glaciers. I know I'm here talking about geology, but check out the bark of this tree. Really interesting. I don't even know what kind of tree this is. If somebody knows, please leave it in the comments down below. But it has the most unusual bark pattern I think I've ever seen. When walking around the park, one of the things that's interesting is there'll be these random granitic rocks that are clearly out of place, and they're littered all over the park. And these are what are known as erratics, or big boulders that were carried on those glaciers from 12,000 years ago. And I'll put my foot on this one. So this isn't the largest one that we'll see, but hopefully we'll see some really large, spectacular ones sitting on top of the Manhattan Shist as we continue through the park. I'm just north of the lake now, and I wanted to make a stop to show you one of these pegmatitic dikes that are in here, or maybe it's a piece of granite that's been caught up within the foliation here. Now, again, I'm not sure about all the ages of these. Again, these rocks went through 3 different periods of tectonic activity, or mountain building activity. The first one being the tectonic, which is what originally metamorphosed these mudstones. The second one was the Acadian, and the third one was the Alleghenian. So you can think of those as what was building the Appalachian Mountains. So this area felt the effects of those as well. Now, those ones, especially the Alleghenian, we're really talking about the building of Pangea, or the supercontinent. And these rocks would have felt the impacts of all of those events. And one of the things that's really cool to see is we can see one of these pegmatitic, looks like dikes coming through. So coming through here, and you can see how it comes over here and then comes back and then comes back again. So this is a beautiful, what we call Z-fold in geology. And it's a hint that we're in an area of high pressure, high temperature, and rocks that went through a lot of deformation. And we can see that across this whole outcrop, and we can actually see chunks of other types of rocks, one of these pegmatites that got caught up in it. And we can see a little bit of striae here as well on top of the foliation. And this striae, some of these lines may actually be related more to glaciation than the foliation, but it can be very hard to tell sometimes. I'm saying that because these look like they're cutting across this fabric, so they're going really perpendicular. So I think these are from the glaciation, these are from the mountain building events. Really cool to see. Made it over to the lake, which is one of the large features in the middle of the park, and we can see the midtown area of Manhattan, including the Empire State Building in the background. Found a panel actually about the geology here, and really about Seneca Village, which was the village that used to occupy this portion of Central Park, but was, through eminent domain, all the residents were removed so they could actually build this portion of Central Park. But it actually talks about the geology here and the idea of the Manhattan Shist, and that a lot of the homes in Seneca Village were actually built from that schist. Swing set break, swing set break. Swinging in Central Park. Just up from where I took a break on the swings is this fabulous jumble of craziness. Now, there's a lot happening in this rock. Let's see if we can decipher a little bit of it. First of all, we still probably have our Manhattan Shist as part of the story. We can see there's this big pegmatitic dike that was caught into it and also was folded and deformed. But what's interesting is we actually can see some different cross-cutting relationships here, including we can see a different vintage of dike formation or seal formation or intrusive rocks coming through that are cross-cutting the fabric of this, as well as cross-cutting some of the other pegmatitic dikes in here. Pretty cool to see, as well as even intruding into this micaceous rich areas, suggesting this was yet another period of time when these rocks were deformed. And maybe these are related to, I wonder if these are related to the either the Akkadian or Alleghenian orogeny. For anybody who's a fan of just really deformed rocks and really fascinating geology and patterns within rocks, this is definitely worth coming to take a look at. You can see all the folds and the foliations, as well as the fact that it's so smooth on top, again because the glaciers came across this feature and just polished the top of it, which allows us to see these patterns so clearly. And for scale, you can see me standing on this exposed portion that was all glaciated, right? It's all polished, and we can see the size of some of these folds behind me. They're like 2 to 3 feet, kind of undulations or amplitude folds that are right behind me here. As I work my way up to what is known as Belvedere Castle, I wanted to point out this rock because it really shows the glacial striae coming across better than I've seen anywhere else. So if you see those lines working this direction, that's from the glacier, tells you the direction the glacier was moving, and then you can see how that is in a different direction than the overall foliation. In fact, it's about 90 degrees or perpendicular to it. And what's neat about this rock is you also have another one of these areas where you have another cross-cutting relationship or a much younger dike cutting through and then later on being folded. So initial stuff deposited in the ocean about 450 million years ago. Then you have the tectonic orogenies shortly after that. It metamorphoses this to make it a schist and starts folding it. And then you have the Akkadian and Alleghenian orogenies, and this dike is probably related to one of those, and the folding at the input and then the folding may have happened during one of those or the one after. So this could be Akkadian in age, and then the folding could have been Alleghenian. I'm not exactly sure, but really neat to see this one rock outcrop and how it records so much history from 450 million years ago all the way up to 12,000 years ago, where you can see this glacial striae. Here's a little bit about the history of Belvedere Tower. It was actually erected in 1869 as a lookout. It now houses the New York Meteorological Observatory, which was founded in 1868. So any of your weather, where they talk about what the weather's like in Central Park, it's actually coming from right up there. How cool is that? So from on top of Belvedere Castle, you get a really nice view. And what I'm most excited about is we can actually get some spectacular views of the Manhattan Shist, and actually maybe where a thrust fault comes through, where you can see that color change. there may actually be a fault zone between those two, which is really cool to see. I'm not positive about that, but I know there is a fault that runs through somewhere in this area, and this fault would have probably been tectonic in age. So as I come over here to the next level down at Belvedere Castle, one thing is you can start seeing the turtles, hence it's called Turtle Pond. But the other part, what you can see is start seeing some of the amazing geology that's here. So again, this is the Manhattan Shist, but you'll notice there's a color change between the lower and the upper section where it goes from kind of a paler color to a darker color, almost black. And you'll see there's a sheen to it. It's probably because that's a fault zone and there's been some kind of deposition from fluids moving through it along that fault zone. So pretty cool to see that here within the park. And again, that fault was probably around 400 million years old when ancient Africa and ancient North America came together and collided during the tectonic orogeny. Pretty neat to see. And I have some background music with a sax player. If you ever do come to Central Park, definitely come check out Belvedere Castle. It is really impressive. Now, again, this is just an architectural flourish within Central Park, but what's cool about it is you get a good view of the rocks. You have some spectacular photo opportunities as well, and you really get a nice panorama of the city from this vantage point in about the central portion of Central Park. Rambling on through the Ramble portion of Central Park, all I can think of is that Jethro Tull song as I'm walking through here. Ramble on. And in the Ramble here, a couple of erratics. This may be my favorite part of the park thus far. Just these rolling, winding pathways going through a bunch of amazing geology with some beautiful trees and really feeling like you're away from the city. And there are rocks. Across from me now is a Bethesda Square, which is famous for all kinds of movies from, I'm actually thinking, I just recently watched John Wick. Of course, there's a bunch of famous scenes there, but When Harry Met Sally, Elf, there's all kinds of scenes that take place within Bethesda Square. And it's right across from me right now. And it was brought to my attention that my favorite movie was filmed here, Enchanted. And through the trees we can see the famous Oxbow Bridge, which is also another spot that's had who knows how many movies filmed along it. And I'm just going to stop here and show this view because just wow, Central Park is amazing and beautiful. And yes, the rocks are amazing, but just the ambiance and just the views is unreal. All right, behind me is something I've actually never seen in person before. It's a rocher montagnais, which is a term for a type of glaciation that takes place. Obviously, a French translation meaning sheet-back rock, and that's because it has a smooth side to it where the glacier came over and polished it, but then it has this rough face up front where as the glacier was going over, it was plucking the rocks off of it. So by looking at this, I can tell you the direction which the glaciers were moving in the last ice age, which is pretty cool to be able to tell that story here. And so this was all polished by those glaciers 12,000 years ago, and as they came across, they went smooth up the backside. So this is that rocher montagnais, the back of the sheep idea, and then they came to this cliff face here where they were slowly plucking rocks off as it continued to roll over it and slowly erode this little nub or knob away. Pretty cool to see one of these in person. It's the first time I've ever seen one, a rocher montagnais. Plus it's fun to say. I love geology terms. And because of that plucking that takes place, it actually leaves some spectacular exposures of the schist, and you can really see how deformed and folded it has been through time as it comes through here. Really, really spectacular to see. Thank you, glaciers. And I've arrived at one of the most famous spots within Central Park, what's known as Bethesda Square. And when people come to Central Park, they often think of this square and this architecture. And of course, numerous movies have all been filmed here, including, as I was reminded, my favorite, Enchanted. which is an ongoing joke in my family and with my friends. Entering into the Bethesda underpass, and absolutely beautiful. Okay, this is awesome. So I'm a big fan of Halloween, and at the top of Bethesda staircase going down towards the fountain, they actually have a witch and pumpkin, very Halloweeny, carved into this pillar. They have an owl with a bat, and then they have a book with a genie lamp here. A chicken! Awesome. They have the sunburst on the other side, and all this is at the top, if I take a step back, of the stairs coming up from the Bethesda Terrace. I moved down to the south side of the park now, and what you have in front of us is one of the best erratics within the park, and there's actually two in this area. I'll show you both of them, but an erratic is a boulder that's been left behind once glaciers came across. In this case, it's a piece of basically granite or maybe gneiss that's been dropped on top of the schist here. Now, the other thing to point out is somewhere along our walk, we went from what is known as the Manhattan Shist to what's known as the Heartland Schist, which are both roughly grouped into the Manhattan Shist family for most people. However, geoscientists will split them out a bit. So we're actually in some slightly younger rocks as part of the Iapetus Ocean, and these rocks are actually thrust upon or over parts of the Manhattan Shist in this area. So these younger rocks are pushed over the older rocks in the park, just kind of north of where I'm at. We'll go take a closer look at the Heartland Schist when we get over to a famous spot here in the park known as Umpire Rock. Okay, now I moved up to another one of these erratics, and this thing is bigger than I am. You'll actually see they put stakes here around this erratic or boulder because it's on a slope, and I imagine when it gets rainy and icy, it would easily be able to slip down. Pretty cool to see some of these erratics, and you can see the type of rock, the weathering, the look of it is very different than the rock that it's on. Now, I'm not exactly sure how far these have traveled, these big boulders, but I imagine it's tens and tens of miles, if not more, with these glaciers. And again, as these glaciers melted, these big boulders would drop out. So it just gives you an idea about the sheer force these glaciers had. Now, this is also an area where we can take a look at what they call the Heartland Schist. One thing I'll point out is it looks like this section is on end. If you remember, it looks like these are vertical. If you remember some of the other areas we were looking at, it still look like there's maybe not quite this much rotation, but this section actually preserves some of the initial fabric in the ancient beds that would have been deposited in the ocean 450 million years ago. And it's been really beaten up. These actually may be not dikes, but what we call deformation bands, because this looks like this is a proto-sandstone and feels like it could be a proto-sandstone. So this could record some kind of fault movement. In fact, there's a fracture plane right in front of me. Now, I did read there were strike slip faults, so faults that move sideways relative to one another that run through portions of the park, and this may actually be one of those strike slip faults, which is really cool to see because I didn't expect to see one today. So one thing I noticed that's different about this Heartland Schist from the Manhattan Shist, being a novice about the geology in this area, is that we see some of these and it looks like this kind of sand bed is still kind of intact. I mean, it's definitely been beaten up, but it's not nearly as metamorphosed as some of the other features I've seen on the other side. The other thing I noticed is that these would have been deposited like this, right? Horizontal, so my fingers would be the beds, but now to match kind of the bedding we see here, they're up at an angle like this, suggesting again that they were faulted and rotated. We know geology generally deposits horizontally, so flat, much like layers of a cake. And so when we see something on its side like this, it tells me there's been some kind of tectonic event or some kind of faulting that's moved it into a spot like this. And we know based on work by others, that there's been 3 orogenies here. Now, most of this is probably during the tectonic orogeny, which is shortly after deposition of these units as that ocean was closing between old Africa and old North America. But then there's 2 other ones. There's the Akkadian, which was about 375 million years ago, and then the Alleghenian, which was around 325 million years ago. So coming back to the erratic, as I get up close, it's very granitic. So again, looks very different and exotic from all the other rocks we've seen really around much of the park. And to give you an idea about the size, this thing is taller than I am, wider than me by 2 or 3 of me. Maybe I need to go on a diet. And it's quite a large boulder, probably weighing tons and tons and tons. That's just been dropped right on top of this Heartland schist. I think one of the most exciting things for me is that I actually saw this deformation right here and what looked like what we call deformation bands. And we see those in sandstones in places like Moab, Utah, and in other areas with a lot of sandstone. And we can see how those deformation bands are very focused right along where this fracture section is. And we can see them a little bit on the other side as well, but they definitely seem to coalesce or be at much greater abundance over here on the left hand side. And they're only in the sandstone and the sandstone units in general, so we can see some down here as well. Pretty cool to see deformation bands in Central Park. Not something I thought I would see. All right, now that I geeked out on this outcrop, way cooler than anything I thought I was going to see when I started walking over. I thought, oh, I'll see erratic, a little bit of Heartland schist. I never had an idea I was going to see the sandstone and the deformation bands. But where I'm going to go from here and take you all is over to one of the most famous spots here, a place called Umpire Rock, because it's a rock that sits over a bunch of the softball and baseball fields here in Central Park. So we'll go take a look at that. Again, that's made of the Heartland schist. And from there, we'll wrap up. Although I'm on a geology tour here, I can't pass up some of these old iconic places. Like this is a carousel here in Central Park. It says it was returned from Minnehapolis go-arounds in 1982, but as I understand it, there used to be a carousel here for a really long time, and then I think it got dilapidated, and then somebody brought it back. But for those who know more about the history, let me know. But this is a look at the carousel here in Central Park. On my way over to Umpire Rock, I just passed this other outcrop. And again, you can see these beautiful folds in here. And it does have a bit of a, maybe even I'll call it a coarser look, a slightly different look than what we were seeing with the Manhattan Shist up above. I definitely don't see as much mica in here. And I did read there should be things like kyanite in this melt as well, although we won't be able to see those individual crystals so well without maybe a microscope. Okay, I made my way over to Umpire Rock, and it looks pretty similar to some of the other rocks we've seen. So let's go work our way up over on top and take a look and see if we notice anything different. This should be some more of that Heartland schist that makes up the southern portion of Central Park. You can see the city skyline behind me. I can imagine as a kid playing in Central Park that this would have been a fantastical world to play in, with these little goalies and rivets and all kinds of fun places to run around and come play up here on Umpire Rock. One of the things that you can see that's very obvious here in this schist is that there's these cross-cutting relationships. So you had the initial deposition of this material in the ocean, then it was folded and deformed during the tectonic orogeny, and then maybe during the Akkadian or Alleghenian orogeny, you had these dikes coming through later on, or they could have been at the later part of the tectonic as well. But there's clearly, these are cross-cutting the deformation that is associated with kind of the main part of the tectonic orogeny, really telling a story about these poor rocks being beaten up time and time again over millions and millions of years. And here's a clue to yet another event that took place here. So you had the initial deposition of this material in the ocean, and then it was crunched up and metamorphosed, where you start seeing all these big folds and kind of chaotic nature to it. And then there was a dike that came across there, so some later volcanic activity, but then that dike was then folded again. So really recording at least 4 different stories, and really 5 different stories at this one spot. The 5th one being, of course, the polishing and the striae from the glaciers 12,000 years ago. So in this one spot, I can start putting together a story of 5 major events that occurred right here in Manhattan over the last 450 million years. And that is why I love being a geologist, is I can come somewhere like this and I can start seeing the story of how this formed, start learning about the earth here. Somewhere in the middle of Manhattan, which you can see behind me, I can still put together with some rocks, and not a lot of rocks, but some rocks, start putting together a story of what happened at this place in time on Earth over a large period of time. Really thinking about the world in 4 dimensions. So cool. And with this culmination of all these different events and just this one small spot, I think this is a great spot to go ahead and sign off from Central Park and looking at the geology of Central Park. Thank you all for joining me today. What an amazing, fantastic day today has been. Starting on the north end of Central Park up at 110, working my way all the way down here to the southern end, checking out all the different geology from the Manhattan Shist to the Heartland Schist, to seeing erratics, to seeing metamorphic rocks, and even seeing deformation bands and evidence for multiple mountain building events that took place in this general region. What a great place to come, and what a great escape from the main hustle and bustle of the city. And I love finding rocks anywhere I go. So with that being said, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please leave comments down below. Have you been here before? Are there some other areas when I come back to New York again I need to check out to talk about the geology or even history in this area? All of it's fascinating to me. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell for notifications so it'll let you know when I have new videos that come out, so you can join me for these adventures and you can learn right alongside with me, because that's one of my favorite things to do here with you all, is to learn with you all. All right, with that being said, thanks all. I appreciate you all joining me today to check out the geology of Central Park, and I'll see you in the next episode and on the next adventure. Take care. All right, here's your pop culture moment with Garrett. This building right there is the home of Zool from the Ghostbusters. So that was the inspiration for that scene and where they filmed part of that scene. In fact, the church the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man steps on is right down there.